4. So we're going back to our previous study. You don't have to read this again because we already wrote it. It's the null hypothesis is the proportion of children with headaches taking antibiotics is this. The claim, according to the doctors or researcher, is this. So we know that this is the null hypothesis, and this is the claim, the alternative hypothesis. Explain what it would mean to make a type 1 error and make a type 2 error. So type 1 will mean reject the null hypothesis when in fact it is true. I don't really like to write this. It is true. Better, I reject the null hypothesis when in fact I should not. Another way of writing it is the sample supports the alternative. So reject, right? So reject the null hypothesis when in fact I should. Sorry. When in fact I should. So reject the null hypothesis when in fact no. I confused myself. Reject the null hypothesis when in fact it is true. Yes, it is. Everything I wrote is correct. Let me write it again just to make sure. Type 1. Reject. I'm making an error. I'm rejecting it when in fact I should not. And that is alpha. Okay, type 2. Of course, it's the other one. Fail to reject. H0 or H0. When I should, when in fact I should. When in fact I should. Rejected. And that is beta. So I reject when I should not. I fail to reject when I should. So type 1 error is when I reject and I should not. Type 2 error is when I fail to reject, but actually I should. Finally, how do we state conclusions on hypothesis testing? So we go back to example 4, this one. Suppose the sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis is rejected. State the conclusion. Okay. So back to the same example where H0 is proportion of kids taking antibiotic and experiencing as a side effect headaches is this, and we are still looking at the same example. So part A reads, suppose the sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis is rejected. So, conclusion. The null hypothesis is rejected. Here's how I write the conclusion. Based on the sample, reject. There is sufficient evidence. I need to put that in. There is sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. I cannot say there is sufficient evidence to accept this. We are not accepting anything. We can only say that based on the sample, from the information we get from the sample, we say there is sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. I cannot conclude that this is carved in stone. I can only say there is evidence that this is no longer true. I cannot say for sure that if I collect 10 more samples, all of them will have a proportion of children with experiencing the side effects greater than 0.02. I cannot conclude that. But what I can say is that based on the sample, there is sufficient evidence coming from the sample that makes us conclude to reject the null hypothesis. This is the language that we have to put in writing for our conclusion. Sufficient evidence coming from the sample to conclude that we have to reject this. Okay, part B. In part B is the opposite. Suppose that the sample evidence indicates that the null hypothesis is not rejected. So another conclusion here, possible, is that fail to reject the null hypothesis. How do I put this in writing? Based on the sample, there is sufficient evidence to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Another way would be, there is not enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, whichever. So based on the sample, there is not enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. I prefer the second one better than the first one. So there is not enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. We don't have enough. And this is conclusion. Either one, but I think that this is better. Based on the sample, there is not enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Any questions? I think what I would like to do, but it's up to you, we can continue moving on to section 10.2, or we can stop for a few minutes and look at some questions in 10.1 in MyLabs Plus. What would you like to do?
The 10.1, honestly.
Okay.
That's me. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Very good. Very good. I am sharing right this moment. And I am going to go to MyLabs Plus. I have it up here. Unless I'm logged out. I'm kind of always logged out. Am I not? Okay. I'm going to move you out of the way. Okay. And this is in 10, 10, 10, 10, 9, 10 interactive homework. Okay. And I want to preview. Any preference? I haven't looked at any, so it's up to you. You choose. Okay, so I'm going to choose then. I'm going to choose 3. Typically, the idea of is that of no effect, no difference, or no change. And here are the options. We already know the answer. Can anyone tell us the answer?
Null hypothesis.
Of course. Of course. That's the idea of no change. Nothing. The status quo is the same. Next problem.
22.
22. Among all credit cards issued, the proportion of cards that result in default was 0.13 in 2010. So can anyone give us the alternative and the null? I mean, you cannot give the alternative yet. What is the null hypothesis here for this problem? H sub 0.
So, it would be mean.
No, it's the proportion of cards. That's why we need to look at these kind of problems. So the proportion P equals 0.13. Very good. A credit analyst with a credit card company believes that this proportion is different today. So what is the alternative?
P is not equal to 0.13.
That's it. That is the correct answer. So the null hypothesis, P, of course. Be very careful because there are other options, right? So we have to choose the correct option. That equals.
So why was it P and not mean, just for me?
Right here.
Oh, sure, easy enough.
That's okay. Okay, I have to find my keyboard. Okay, 0.13. Good. And then again P. And then it says is different today. Perfect. Of 0.13. Any questions on this? I didn't mean that. Oh, we didn't finish. Sorry. There is something else here. Explain what it would mean to make a type 1 error. So reject the null when it is true. If the sample data leads an analyst to reject the null hypothesis and the proportion of cards that result in default has not changed. So if we reject the null hypothesis, when in fact the null hypothesis is correct, so, and the proportion of cards that result in default has not changed. So we rejected the null hypothesis, but actually nothing changed, is a type 1 error. We rejected a statement that was correct. Okay, there is more to it. Look at that. Explain what it would mean to make a type 2 error. That is, again, when I fail to reject and I should reject. If the sample data leads an analyst to fail to reject the null hypothesis and the proportion of cards that result in the default has changed. So I failed to reject the null hypothesis. So I reject when it's true, and I fail to reject when it is false. One more time. If the sample data leads to the analyst to fail to reject the null hypothesis, when actually the null hypothesis is not supported. The information coming from the sample is not supported, will not support the null hypothesis. The result in default has changed. So I fail to reject the null hypothesis when actually the null hypothesis is false. There is more to it. Look at that. State the conclusion that would be reached if the null hypothesis was not rejected. There is sufficient evidence at the alpha level to support the analyst's belief that the proportion of cards that result in the default has. So it says failed to reject, was not rejected. There is not sufficient evidence. I have to read this twice before I select. There is not sufficient evidence at the, because we are not rejecting. There is not sufficient evidence at the alpha level to support the analyst's belief that the proportion of cards that result in default has changed. So one more time before we click. We do not reject the null hypothesis. It says, state the conclusion that would be reached if the null hypothesis was not rejected. There isn't sufficient evidence coming from this sample at the alpha level of support, alpha level to support the analyst's belief that the proportion of cards that result in default has changed. There is not sufficient evidence. There is more. There is more. State the conclusion that would be reached if the null hypothesis was rejected. There is sufficient evidence at the alpha level to support the analyst's belief that the proportion of cards that result in default has changed. One more time. We reject the null hypothesis. There is sufficient evidence at the alpha level to support the analyst's belief that the proportion of cards that result in the default has changed. There is sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Good pick.
We try 14.
Yes? 14 it is.